What if the key to solving humanity's greatest threats was hidden in Africa's oldest wisdom? Right now, the world feels like it's unraveling. Our climate is collapsing, oceans rising, forests burning. Inequality is at an all-time high. While the richest grow richer, billions struggle to survive. Societies are fracturing under the weight of division, polarization, and alienation. Technology connects us more than ever, yet loneliness is now a global epidemic. People search for answers in politics, in science, in innovation. But what if the solutions we're chasing have already existed? Long before skyscrapers, satellites, and supercomputers. What if ancient African spirituality held a blueprint for global survival? This isn't about mythology or mysticism. This is about living systems of thought, cosmic philosophies, and moral technologies that guided civilizations for thousands of years. From the Nile Valley to the Congo Basin, from the deserts of the Sahel to the plains of South Africa, African spiritual traditions taught something revolutionary: that life is sacred, that balance is law, and that no one exists in isolation. Systems like Maat from ancient Kemet, Ubuntu from Southern Africa, and Ifa from the Yoruba world offered frameworks of harmony, justice, reciprocity, and ecological respect. Not as ideals, but as daily practice. These traditions weren't about escape. They were about alignment. They didn't seek to dominate nature, but to dance with it. They didn't elevate one group over another, but reminded us that we are threads in a single tapestry. These aren't just old beliefs. They are urgent medicine. So why has this wisdom been ignored, suppressed, dismissed as primitive or pagan? And more importantly, what could happen if we finally listened? If the world turned to the very philosophies it once tried to erase? This isn't just a story about Africa. It's a story about the future. And it starts with remembering. Long before Africa was carved into colonies, before its names were changed and its stories rewritten, its people lived by systems of spiritual intelligence that governed far more than worship. They governed life itself. These systems weren't religions in the way the modern world understands them. They were frameworks, codes, technologies, ways of tuning human behavior to the deeper rhythms of the universe. They weren't meant to separate people by belief, but to align them with truth, cosmic, eternal, and communal. In ancient Kemet, what many now call Egypt, the foundation of spiritual life was Maat. More than a goddess, Maat was a universal principle. Balance, truth, justice, harmony, reciprocity. She represented the order of the cosmos, the alignment of nature, and the ethical path of humanity. To live in Maat was to live rightly, with yourself, with your neighbor, with the earth. Every action had weight. Every choice tipped the scales. Leaders were not judged by wealth or power, but by whether their rule reflected Maat. Even in death, the heart was weighed against her feather, not by a god's opinion, but by the law of balance itself. Far to the south, in the lands of the Zulu, Xhosa, and other Bantu-speaking peoples, another sacred code took root: Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not a prayer. It is not a ritual. It is a truth about the nature of being. I am because we are. This is the heart of Ubuntu. It teaches that a person is only a person through their relationships with others. There is no individual salvation, no isolated identity. The health of the one is bound to the health of the many. Ubuntu recognizes that humanity is a network, not a hierarchy. And within that network, kindness, generosity, forgiveness, and mutual care are not optional. They are sacred responsibilities. And in West Africa, among the Yoruba, the Ifa system flourished, a vast spiritual cosmology governed by Orunmila, the deity of wisdom and divination. Ifa isn't about blind faith, it's about patterns. Through the sacred Odu, verses containing thousands of years of encoded knowledge. Ifa reveals the blueprint of life, the balance between forces, and the consequences of disharmony. At its core, Ifa teaches that nothing exists in isolation. Every action sends ripples. Every word is a spell. Every human is born with a destiny, yes, but also with the freedom to shape it through alignment with divine order. These systems, Maat, Ubuntu, Ifa, don't divide the world into sacred and secular. There is no split between body and soul, spirit and matter, heaven and earth. Unlike the Western dualism that separates humans from nature, the divine from the material, these African systems see everything as one. The universe is not a battleground between good and evil. It is a field of energy, interconnected, dynamic, balanced. To harm the earth is to harm oneself. To betray another is to betray the divine spark within. Everything is linked. Nothing is meaningless. And these aren't dusty philosophies locked in the past. They are living systems. They are blueprints for governance, economics, justice, community, and ecology. They are spiritual technologies, tools of alignment that can be applied to modern life. They don't ask us to believe. They ask us to remember, to return to a way of living that understands power as responsibility, wisdom as service, and spirit as the substance of all things. In a world unraveling from disconnection, these teachings call us back, not to dogma, but to coherence. Not to worship for worship's sake, but to walk in right relationship with each other, with the planet, with the ancestors, and with the divine pattern that holds it all together. Modern climate discourse often revolves around numbers. Carbon parts per million, global temperature thresholds, rising sea levels. The earth is treated as a data set, a commodity, a resource to be managed and manipulated. In the Western paradigm, nature is something outside of us, an object to be extracted from, tamed, exploited, or preserved only when convenient. Forests become timber, rivers become dams, mountains become mines. The spiritual has been stripped from the ecological, and in doing so, balance has been lost. But in traditional African spiritual systems, earth is not a thing. It is not inert matter. It is alive, conscious, sacred. The earth is not a resource. It is a relative. It breathes, it remembers, it responds. In Ifa cosmology, for instance, the planet is known as Aye, a spirit in her own right. She is not owned and she is not silent. When Aye is mistreated, when her rivers are poisoned, her soil violated, her animals slaughtered without purpose, there are consequences. Not just environmental but spiritual. Imbalance in nature is seen as imbalance in the moral fabric of life itself. This is not poetic metaphor. It is law, cosmic, ancestral, and binding. In Ifa teachings, everything is interconnected. The elements are not just chemical, they are spiritual forces. Fire has a name. Water has intention. Trees have memory. When an elder cuts a tree, it is done with prayer, permission, and purpose. Nothing is taken without acknowledgement of its cost. This is not superstition. It is sustainability rooted in sacredness. Ubuntu 2 reframes how we relate to the natural world. If I am because we are, then we must include more than humans. It must include the forests that give us breath, the rivers that give us life, the animals that share our journey. In many Bantu-speaking cultures, animals are not lesser beings. They are totems, ancestors, messengers. To destroy their habitats is to injure a part of the collective soul. The environment is not an external issue. It is an extension of the self. This perspective has radical implications for climate justice. It shifts the conversation from control to relationship, from regulation to reverence. Imagine climate policy built not just on emissions targets, but on ethical responsibility. Imagine corporations forced to consider the spiritual consequence of what they extract. Imagine governments guided not by profit margins, but by the principle of Maat, balance, truth, reciprocity with the earth. This isn't idealism. It's urgent. Because the current model, where the earth is treated as an endless supply chain, is failing. Forests are falling. Water is drying. Ice is melting. And while science can measure the damage, only spirit can restore the relationship. What African spiritual systems remind us is that sustainability is not just technical, it is ethical. It is spiritual. It is about remembering that we are not above the earth, but of it. The wisdom of these systems doesn't just call for environmental action, it calls for environmental communion. A way of living where climate justice is not a policy document, but a way of life. Where planting a tree is a prayer. Where water is not just a resource, but a relative. Where every footprint on the land is made with humility. In a time when the earth is crying out, perhaps the most revolutionary thing we can do is listen. Not just with science, but with soul. And Africa, long dismissed as primitive, may hold the sacred key to a truly sustainable future. One not built on control, but on care. One rooted not in conquest, but in connection. In the ancient world of Kemet, what many now call Egypt, spirituality and governance were not separate. At the heart of both stood Maat, a principle so foundational that it shaped not only personal ethics, but the very structure of society. Maat was more than a deity. She was balance itself. She embodied truth, justice, harmony, reciprocity, and cosmic order. Every sunrise, every flood of the Nile, every act of kindness or cruelty echoed through the scales of Maat. It was said that the entire universe was held together by her presence, and when she was forgotten, disorder followed. Unlike many modern societies where justice is handled by fallible courts and truth is twisted by propaganda, ancient Kemet understood that justice had to be rooted in something deeper than law. It had to be rooted in the sacred. Kings, pharaohs, and common people alike were bound by Maat. Rulers were not just political figures. They were spiritual custodians, judged not by how many monuments they built or wars they won, but by how closely their rule aligned with cosmic balance. If they governed without Maat, their power was illegitimate, even dangerous. The throne was not above Maat, it existed to serve it. Now consider our world today. Corruption is normalized. Lies dominate headlines. Leaders ascend through manipulation, money, and military might, not wisdom or virtue. Economic systems thrive on exploitation. Justice systems protect the powerful and criminalize the poor. Entire nations are built on imbalance, and that imbalance breeds chaos, social unrest, inequality, environmental collapse. It is a world crying out for Maat. What would it look like if our leaders were held accountable to a higher spiritual law? Not just through elections or courts, but through an ethical code rooted in universal truth. Imagine presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, and judges evaluated not just by approval ratings or profits, but by how well their actions upheld reciprocity and balance. Imagine governance where decisions were measured by their impact on the most vulnerable, where truth wasn't a tool of power, but a requirement of leadership. Maat teaches that there is no true power without justice. That truth is not optional. That harmony is not weakness. It is the only foundation strong enough to hold a society together. In Kemet, even in death, the soul was not judged by religious affiliation, but by alignment with Maat. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale, weighed against her feather. If it was heavy with deceit, cruelty, or injustice, the soul was devoured. If it was light with truth, it moved forward. This isn't mythology. It's a moral technology. a system of accountability that transcends legal loopholes and partisan games. It demands not just ethical leadership, but spiritual leadership, not just fairness, but sacred duty. It asks, what would governance look like if the highest goal wasn't profit or control, but balance? In our time of global crisis, where injustice festers and power corrupts, perhaps Maat offers a path back to sanity. Not a regression into the past, but a recovery of eternal principles. A return to truth as a compass. Justice as a mandate. Reciprocity as the structure of all human relations. It's not about imposing ancient rituals on the present. It's about applying ancient wisdom to modern crises. When power forgets balance, destruction follows. But when balance leads power, transformation becomes possible. Maat reminds us that a world in chaos is not simply suffering, it is out of alignment. And only by restoring that alignment can we find peace. Not just politically, but cosmically. Not just in courts, but in the conscience of every leader and every citizen. One of the greatest paradoxes of our time is that we are more connected than ever, digitally, globally, instantly, yet more isolated, divided, and lonely than any generation before us. Despite the constant ping of notifications, the endless scroll of social feeds, and the illusion of perpetual contact, people are starving for real connection. Rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are climbing across all age groups. Communities are fragmented, families estranged. Cities filled with millions of people can feel colder than deserts. The modern world, in its quest for individual freedom and personal achievement, has created a crisis of disconnection. This crisis is not just emotional, it is spiritual. Because humans were never meant to live in isolation. We were not designed to be alone, nor to build lives that revolve solely around the self. In African thought, this truth has always been clear. Ubuntu, a spiritual and ethical principle rooted in Southern African cultures, offers a direct answer to this cultural emptiness. Ubuntu teaches, a person is a person through other persons. It is not a slogan. It is a way of being. It means that your humanity is incomplete without others. That your dignity, your well-being, your identity is inseparable from the community around you. In a society grounded in Ubuntu, success is not measured by individual wealth, but by collective upliftment. Empathy is not optional, it is essential. Elders are not discarded, they are honored. The sick are not hidden, they are cared for. Children are not raised by two parents alone, they are raised by villages. In an Ubuntu-based world, your pain is my pain. Your joy is my joy. Your suffering calls me to action. This is more than kindness. It is a spiritual mandate. Imagine if economies were built on interdependence rather than competition. If businesses operated with Ubuntu at the core, prioritizing well-being over bottom lines, collaboration over domination. What if schools taught children not just math and science, but the sacred art of relationship? What if healthcare didn't just treat symptoms but healed the loneliness at the root of so much disease? In an Ubuntu world, hospitals would be hubs of collective care. Workplaces would be families. Neighborhoods would become living ecosystems of support. Mental health too would be transformed. In Western frameworks, healing is often seen as a solitary journey. Individual therapy, self-help books, silent suffering. But Ubuntu reminds us that healing happens in community. That sometimes what the soul needs is not a diagnosis but a circle. Not a pill but a presence. Not advice but witness. The very act of being seen, heard, and held by others is medicine. And this is something Ubuntu cultures have always known. Polarization, another plague of our time, also dissolves in the presence of Ubuntu. When your worldview begins with "I am because you are," there is no space for dehumanizing the other. Even disagreement becomes sacred, an opportunity to grow together rather than tear each other down. Ubuntu doesn't deny conflict. It reframes it, not as war, but as work. The work of maintaining the web that connects us all. The wisdom of Ubuntu is ancient, but its relevance is urgent. It speaks to boardrooms and bedrooms, to schools and governments, to those isolated in cities and those broken by conflict. It doesn't just offer advice, it offers architecture, a blueprint for rebuilding relationships in every sphere of life. As the world grows colder, louder, and more divided, Ubuntu invites us to warm our hands at the fire of human connection, to remember that we are not alone, that we were never meant to be, and that through each other, we become whole. This isn't nostalgia, it's necessity. Ubuntu is not the past, it is the cures. What if the world's survival doesn't depend on what's next, but on what was first? What if the answers to our most urgent crises, climate collapse, spiritual disconnection, systemic injustice, have been waiting in plain sight, buried under centuries of colonization, shame, and silence? African spiritual systems are not cultural relics to be studied from a distance. They are living blueprints, ethical maps, technologies of balance, restoration, and connection. They do not offer escape, they offer a return to harmony with the earth, a return to justice grounded in spirit, a return to each other. These systems, Maat, Ubuntu, Ifa, are not footnotes in history. They are foundations. They were not primitive, they were prophetic. They spoke of truth before truth became fragmented. They lived sustainability before it became a marketing slogan. They understood a relationship before the modern world forgot what it meant to be human. They remind us that our disconnection from the divine, from nature, from each other, is not natural. It is a wound, and it can be healed. This is not about idolizing the past. It is about remembering what the future demands. Because without balance, there is collapse. Without reciprocity, there is injustice. Without community, there is no peace. And without the sacred, there is no survival. The wisdom of Africa is not old, it is eternal. And now as the world trembles, we must choose. Continue the descent into disconnection, or rediscover the wisdom that once held civilizations together. Return is not weakness, it is power. Reconnection is not regression, it is evolution. And remembering is not rebellion, it is resurrection. The world is crying out for a different path. Africa may not only know that path, it may have never left it. If this message stirred something in you, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know how these truths resonate in your life, in your culture, in your future. Because this is not just a conversation, it's a movement, and it's only beginning. Join us next time for The Sacred Future, African Technology Beyond the Material, where we explore how African science, symbolism, and cosmology can shape tomorrow's innovation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. The ancestors are listening, and the future is watching.